Veteran and his dog follow. Pawprints into the marsh, a hidden tunnel reveals their family name. You're about to witness an incredible journey of discovery that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the secrets that bind us together across generations. A decorated war veteran and his faithful companion are about to follow a trail that leads not just through the mysterious Louisiana bayous, but through time itself, uncovering truths that have been buried for decades. This story will take you from the humid marshlands of the Deep South to the depths of a family mystery so profound it will change two lives forever. If you're ready for a tale that celebrates the unbreakable bonds between man and dog and the power of truth to heal old wounds, then hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on those notifications, because what you're about to discover will restore your faith in the connections that matter most. The Louisiana sun hung low over the Atchafalaya Basin, casting long shadows through the massive cypress trees and Spanish moss that draped the landscape like ancient funeral shrouds. The air was thick with humidity and the complex sense of decay and rebirth that characterized the bayou country, where water and land existed in a constant state of negotiation, where boundaries shifted with the tides and seasons, and where secrets could remain hidden for generations in the labyrinthine waterways that stretched for hundreds of square miles. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, recently retired from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division after 12 years of distinguished service, guided his weathered aluminum john boat through the narrow channels with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up navigating these treacherous waters. His hands, scarred from combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, moved the paddle with the efficient strokes that his grandmother had taught him during childhood summers, spent exploring the endless maze of bayous, channels, and backwaters that defined this primordial landscape. Beside him in the boat sat Ranger, a Belgian Malinois whose tan and black coat was still regulation short despite their recent transition to civilian life 6 months earlier. The dog's intelligent brown eyes were constantly moving, tracking the sounds and movements of the marsh with the hypervigilance that had kept both him and Marcus alive during 4 years of partnership in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. Ranger's ears were constantly adjusting, processing the splash of a nutria diving for cover, the haunting call of a great blue heron announcing their passage, the distant rumble of a shrimp boat making its way through the deeper channels toward the Gulf of Mexico. Marcus had returned to Louisiana 8 months ago, using his accumulated military savings to purchase a small Acadian-style house on stilts near Breaux Bridge, in the heart of Cajun country, where his grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8 years old. The house sat on 2 acres of high ground, surrounded by centuries-old live oak trees draped with Spanish moss, with a wooden dock extending into a bayou that connected to the larger waterway system that had been Marcus's childhood playground. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy for either Marcus or Ranger. After 12 years of military structure, combat deployments, and the constant purpose that came with serving in elite units, the quiet rhythms of bayou life felt simultaneously comforting and disorienting. Marcus struggled with the hypervigilance and sleep disturbances that came with post-traumatic stress, while Ranger had difficulty adjusting to a life without the structured missions and clear objectives that had defined their military partnership. The daily excursions into the marsh served multiple crucial purposes for both man and dog. They provided the physical exercise that Ranger's working dog genetics demanded and that Marcus's military conditioning required. They offered the kind of purposeful activity that eased the psychological challenges of adjusting to retirement from active duty. Most importantly, they allowed Marcus to reconnect with the landscape of his childhood and the cultural traditions that had shaped his identity before military service had taken him around the world. Ranger had been Marcus's military working dog partner for the last 4 years of his service, specializing in explosive detection and patrol work in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Belgian Malinois had saved Marcus's life more times than either of them could count, detecting improvised explosive devices that would have killed entire squads, finding wounded soldiers in rubble that human searchers had missed, and providing the kind of loyal partnership that had sustained Marcus through the darkest moments of combat deployment. When Marcus retired, the military had offered to reassign Ranger to another handler, but Marcus couldn't bear the thought of separating from the dog who had become more than a partner. Ranger was family, brother in arms, and the one living being who truly understood the experiences they had shared. Marcus had used his accumulated savings and navigated months of complex bureaucratic processes to adopt Ranger officially, making the dog his responsibility and companion for the remainder of their lives. This morning's expedition had taken them deeper into the Atchafalaya Basin than they usually ventured, following waterways that Marcus remembered from his youth but hadn't explored in over a decade. The basin was a vast wilderness area, covering over 1 million acres of swamps, marshes, and bottomland forests that served as a crucial habitat for countless species of wildlife and as a natural buffer against storm surge from the increasingly violent hurricanes that swept in from the Gulf of Mexico with growing frequency. Marcus had grown up in this area, under the loving care of his grandmother, Mère Claudette Boudreau Thompson, who had taken him in after his parents' tragic death and raised him with a combination of fierce love, Cajun traditions, and practical wisdom about surviving and thriving in the challenging environment of South Louisiana. Mère had taught him the intricate ways of the bayou, how to read the subtle changes in water levels and weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death, how to find the hidden channels that would take you where you needed to go while avoiding the dead ends and dangerous shallows that could strand you for hours, how to respect the power of the marsh and the creatures that called it home. But throughout Marcus's childhood and into his adult years, there had always been parts of his family history that Mère had been reluctant to discuss in detail. Whenever Marcus had asked about his grandfather, Claude Thompson, who had died before Marcus was born, or about other relatives who might have lived in the area, or about why their family seemed to have no connections to the extended network of French-speaking families that populated the region, Mère would grow quiet and change the subject with a skill that suggested long practice. She had raised Marcus with unwavering love and devotion, teaching him to speak French as fluently as English, sharing the traditional recipes and stories that connected him to his heritage, and ensuring that he understood the history and culture of the Acadian people who had made Louisiana their home. But she had never fully explained why they seemed to exist in isolation from the larger community, why there were no uncles or cousins or family reunions, why the Thompson name didn't appear on any of the historical markers or family trees that chronicled the settlement of the region. Marcus had joined the military partly to see the world beyond the bayou and to serve his country in the tradition of young men from rural Louisiana who had always answered the call to defend America. But he had also joined partly to escape the questions about his family's past that no one seemed willing or able to answer, hoping that military service would provide him with the sense of belonging and identity that he had never quite found in civilian Louisiana. Military life had indeed given Marcus structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging that transcended the mysteries of his family background. The army had become his family, his fellow soldiers, his brothers, and the missions they accomplished together his identity. But now that he was back in Louisiana, living in the landscape of his childhood and trying to build a civilian life, the unanswered questions about his family history were beginning to surface again with renewed urgency. The bayou held memories and secrets that Marcus was only beginning to understand. As a child, he had explored these waterways with the fearless curiosity of youth, but he had never had the adult perspective and life experience that would allow him to see patterns and anomalies that might have been significant. Now, returning as a combat veteran with training in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, Marcus was beginning to notice details about the landscape and the local history that he had missed during his younger years. This morning, as Marcus guided the John boat through a particularly narrow channel bordered by towering cypress trees, whose massive trunks disappeared into the dark water, Ranger suddenly became alert in the focused way that meant he had detected something worthy of immediate investigation. The dog's nose was working overtime, testing the complex array of scents that filled the humid air with information that humans could barely perceive, and his body language indicated the kind of intense interest that Marcus recognized from their military operations. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked quietly, automatically scanning the area with the tactical awareness that had become second nature during years of combat operations. Ranger was looking toward a small island, or slightly elevated area of land that was covered with thick vegetation and appeared to be rarely visited by humans or even wildlife. Marcus had probably passed this spot dozens of times during his childhood explorations of the marsh, but he had never paid particular attention to it because it looked like countless other small patches of dry land that dotted the basin, unremarkable, overgrown, and apparently uninhabited. But Ranger continued to show the kind of focused interest that Marcus had learned to take seriously during their military partnership. The dog had been trained to detect explosives, drugs, and human presence, but he had also developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was out of place or worthy of closer examination. During their years of working together in combat zones, Ranger's alerts had led them to discover hidden weapons caches, concealed enemy positions, and other significant findings that had saved lives and advanced mission objectives. Marcus decided to investigate what had captured Ranger's attention so completely. He guided the John boat toward the small island, looking for a place where they could safely beach the vessel and explore on foot without damaging the boat's hull or getting stuck in shallow water. The approach required careful navigation through increasingly shallow water and around the massive cypress knees that could puncture an aluminum hull if struck at the wrong angle or with too much force. As they got closer to the island, Marcus could see that it was substantially larger than it had appeared from a distance, probably covering about 3 acres of slightly elevated ground that supported a thick growth of palmetto, wild iris, young cypress trees, and other vegetation typical of Louisiana marshland. What struck Marcus as unusual, however, was the absence of the typical debris and flood marks that he would expect to see on land that was regularly inundated during high water periods, storms, or seasonal flooding. Marcus beached the John boat on a small sandy area that appeared to be naturally formed and secured it with an anchor before stepping onto the island with Ranger close behind him. The dog immediately began a systematic search of the area, using the methodical pattern he had employed during military operations to clear potentially dangerous terrain and ensure that no threats were present before allowing his handler to proceed with whatever mission they were undertaking. The island felt different from the surrounding marsh in ways that Marcus couldn't immediately identify or articulate. The vegetation was lusher and more diverse than what he typically saw on similar patches of high ground throughout the basin, and there was a sense of permanence and stability about the place that suggested it hadn't been shaped entirely by the natural forces of water, wind, and seasonal change that dominated the marsh environment. The soil beneath his feet felt solid and well drained, unlike the typical marsh ground that was usually soft and saturated with water. The vegetation showed signs of having been managed or cultivated at some point in the past, with species that weren't entirely native to the area and growth patterns that suggested human intervention rather than purely natural development. Ranger had moved to an area near the center of the island where the palmetto growth was particularly thick, and the canopy of young trees created deep shadows that made visibility difficult. The dog was showing the kind of focused, intense interest that Marcus recognized from their military service. When Ranger had detected something that warranted immediate human attention but didn't represent an immediate threat to their safety, Marcus pushed through the palmetto fronds and thick undergrowth to join Ranger and immediately saw what had caught the dog's attention so completely. Partially hidden beneath decades of vegetation growth and covered by a thick layer of organic matter was what appeared to be the remnants of a substantial structure. Concrete foundation blocks, weathered wooden beams, and pieces of rusted metal were scattered throughout the area, suggesting that someone had built something significant on this island at some point in the past. What made the discovery particularly intriguing and puzzling was the quality and sophistication of the construction materials that Marcus could see. The concrete blocks were substantial and professionally poured, showing evidence of reinforcing steel and careful engineering, rather than the rough improvised construction that Marcus would expect from a hunting camp, fishing shack, or other temporary structure that someone might have built in such a remote location. The wooden beams showed evidence of careful joinery and professional finishing, with mortise and tenon joints and other sophisticated carpentry techniques that suggested whoever had built here had intended the structure to be permanent and had possessed considerable skill and resources. The metal components, though heavily corroded by decades of exposure to the humid Louisiana climate, appeared to have been substantial hardware of a type used for industrial or institutional applications rather than residential construction. Marcus began a more systematic and thorough exploration of the area, documenting what he found with his phone's camera, while Ranger continued his own detailed investigation of the site. The dog seemed particularly interested in one area where the vegetation was less dense, and the ground showed subtle variations that might indicate buried structures or concealed features that weren't immediately visible to human observation. As Marcus followed Ranger through the overgrown foundation area, pushing aside palmetto fronds and stepping over fallen logs and accumulated debris, he began to notice other details that suggested this site had been much more than just a simple structure or residence. There were the remains of what appeared to be a sophisticated drainage system, with concrete channels and corroded metal grating that would have been expensive and difficult to install in such a remote location without significant planning and resources. The placement and orientation of the foundation blocks suggested a building that had been quite large and complex, possibly containing multiple rooms or levels, and designed according to architectural principles rather than the simple, functional construction that characterized most rural Louisiana buildings of earlier eras. The site showed evidence of careful site preparation, professional surveying and engineering that was far beyond what would be typical for civilian construction in the marsh during the mid-20th century. Ranger had stopped at what appeared to be the corner of the former structure and was poring intently at something beneath the thick layer of organic matter that covered the ground. The dog's behavior indicated that he was detecting scents or traces that were emanating from below the surface, suggesting that there might be additional structures or materials buried beneath the accumulated decades of fallen leaves, moss, and other organic debris. Marcus knelt beside Ranger and began carefully clearing away the accumulated material, using his hands to remove layers of decomposed vegetation, soil, and debris that had built up over what appeared to be many years, or possibly decades. As he worked, he uncovered a section of concrete that was different from the foundation blocks they had been finding throughout the area. The concrete surface that Marcus exposed was a smooth, professionally finished slab with metal fittings embedded in it that looked like they might have been designed to secure some kind of hatch, access panel, or entrance to an underground area. The metal hardware was heavily corroded and partially consumed by rust, but Marcus could see that it had once been substantial and sophisticated, the kind of engineering that would be used for industrial, military, or high-security applications. The discovery sent a chill down Marcus's spine as he began to consider the implications of what he was looking at. Someone had built a substantial, professionally constructed facility on this remote island and had included what appeared to be secure access to an underground installation or storage area. This wasn't the kind of construction that would be associated with hunting camps, fishing operations, or the other civilian activities that occasionally brought people into the deep marsh. Marcus's military experience included extensive training in the recognition of various types of installations and facilities, including underground bunkers, command centers, and concealed storage areas. What he was looking at had characteristics that suggested something designed for concealment, security, and long-term operation in a location where discovery would be extremely unlikely. The location itself was ideal for a hidden facility that needed to remain undetected for extended periods. The island was remote, difficult to access, and surrounded by natural barriers that would discourage casual exploration. The thick vegetation provided natural camouflage, and the isolation of the site meant that activities could be conducted without observation from the outside world. Ranger continued to show intense interest in the concrete slab area, and Marcus could see that the dog was detecting scents that were emanating from beneath the surface. The metal fittings appeared to be part of a hatch system that had been designed to provide access to whatever lay below, but decades of corrosion, vegetation growth, and the accumulation of organic matter had sealed the opening and concealed its existence. Marcus examined the metal fittings more closely and realized that they were significantly more sophisticated than he had initially thought. Despite the heavy corrosion that had consumed much of the surface detail, he could see evidence of precision engineering, high-quality materials, and manufacturing standards that suggested military or government specifications rather than civilian construction. The hardware included what appeared to be heavy-duty hinges, locking mechanisms, and sealing systems that would have been designed to keep the underground area secure and protected from water infiltration, unauthorized access, and environmental contamination. Someone had invested considerable time, money, and expertise in creating access to whatever was hidden beneath this island. The military training that had served Marcus well in combat zones around the world was now telling him that he had stumbled onto something that had been deliberately concealed and might still be significant or sensitive. His first instinct was to document everything carefully and then report his discovery to appropriate federal authorities, but something made him hesitate before taking that step. This island was located deep in the marsh, in an area that had been part of Marcus's childhood exploration territory and that connected to waterways he had been navigating for most of his life. If there had been a significant federal installation here, it would have been built during or before his lifetime, possibly during the period when his family had been living in the area and his grandfather had been alive. The questions about his family history that had never been satisfactorily answered suddenly seemed more urgent and potentially relevant to what he had discovered. The secrecy that had surrounded his grandfather's life and work, the isolation of his family from the broader community, and the reluctance of his grandmother to discuss certain aspects of their past might all be connected to the hidden installation that lay beneath this island. Marcus made the decision to attempt to open the hatch before involving outside authorities in his discovery. His military experience included extensive training in various types of mechanical systems, entry techniques, and the assessment of potentially dangerous or sensitive situations. He had tools in his boat that might allow him to remove enough corrosion and debris to assess what lay beneath the concrete slab without causing damage or compromising whatever security might still be in place. Working carefully to avoid damaging whatever mechanism remained functional after decades of exposure to the harsh Louisiana environment, Marcus began the painstaking process of clearing corrosion and accumulated debris from the metal fittings. Ranger maintained his position near the hatch area, alert but calm, suggesting that whatever was below didn't represent an immediate threat, but remained worthy of careful attention and investigation. The work was slow and physically demanding, requiring Marcus to use various tools from his military kit to carefully remove rust, clear blocked drainage, and assess the condition of the mechanical systems that controlled access to the underground area. The engineering had been sophisticated enough to include drainage systems that had prevented complete flooding of the mechanism, and the materials had been chosen to withstand long-term exposure to moisture and corrosion. After nearly 2 hours of careful, methodical work, Marcus managed to clear enough of the mechanism to attempt opening the hatch. The metal protested and groaned as he applied pressure, but the engineering had been sound enough that the basic mechanical systems had survived decades of exposure to the humid Louisiana climate without complete failure. With a final effort that engaged muscles he had developed during years of military training and combat operations, Marcus lifted the heavy concrete and metal hatch, revealing a dark opening that descended into the earth beneath the island. Cool, dry air rose from the opening, carrying scents that suggested a substantial underground space with adequate ventilation and environmental control systems that had continued to function despite the apparent abandonment of the facility. The opening revealed a set of concrete steps leading down into what appeared to be a professionally constructed underground chamber or facility. The construction was clearly institutional or military in character, designed to withstand the significant engineering challenges of building below the water table in marsh terrain, while maintaining structural integrity and habitability over extended periods. Marcus retrieved a military-grade flashlight from his boat and returned to the hatch opening with Ranger. The dog showed cautious interest in the underground space, but displayed none of the alarm signals that would indicate immediate danger, suggesting that whatever was down there didn't represent a threat to their safety, but warranted careful investigation. Marcus's military training included extensive experience with underground facilities, tunnel systems, and concealed installations, and he felt confident in his ability to safely explore what lay beneath the island while maintaining appropriate caution and security awareness. The construction he could see appeared to be professional and substantial, suggesting that whoever had built this facility had possessed significant resources and expertise. The concrete steps were solid and well constructed, showing evidence of professional engineering and construction techniques that would have been expensive and difficult to implement in such a remote location. The steps led down approximately 15 feet before opening into a chamber that appeared to extend well beyond the footprint of the structure that had once stood on the surface. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed a space that was much larger and more sophisticated than he had expected, with concrete walls, a poured concrete floor, and a ceiling supported by steel beams that had been treated against corrosion. The facility had clearly been designed to remain functional and habitable, even in the challenging environment of the Louisiana marsh, with waterproofing, ventilation, and environmental control systems that spoke to significant investment and professional planning. The chamber was surprisingly dry and well preserved, with concrete surfaces that showed minimal water damage and steel components that had been protected from the corrosion that had affected the surface hardware. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of electronics and preserved materials, suggesting that the facility had maintained controlled environmental conditions even during its apparent abandonment. As Marcus and Ranger explored the chamber, Marcus's flashlight revealed that the space was divided into multiple rooms and areas, each apparently designed for specific functions or activities. The main chamber appeared to have served as a command or control center, with built-in desks, mounting points for equipment and electrical systems that had been designed to support sophisticated electronic devices and communication equipment. Some of the equipment that remained in the facility looked like communication devices from several decades past, while other items appeared to be related to monitoring, surveillance, or data collection activities. All of it was old enough to suggest that the facility had been active during the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s, but recent enough to indicate that it had been operational during Marcus's lifetime and possibly during his childhood. The level of sophistication and the apparent purpose of the facility suggested federal government or military involvement rather than civilian or commercial activities. The construction techniques, security measures, and equipment specifications were consistent with classified or sensitive operations that would have required significant authorization and oversight from federal agencies. In one corner of the main chamber, Marcus discovered something that made his hands shake as he held the flashlight beam steady on what he was seeing. There was a desk area with filing cabinets and document storage that had been protected from moisture and environmental damage by the facility's climate control systems. On the desk, partially covered by a thin layer of dust, but still clearly visible and legible, was a nameplate that read, "Claude Thompson, Operations Supervisor." Marcus stared at the nameplate for several minutes, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing. Thompson was his family name, and Claude had been his grandfather's first name, but Marcus had never heard his grandfather referred to by his full name or described in terms that suggested professional or federal employment. Throughout his childhood, when his grandmother had reluctantly discussed his grandfather at all, she had described Claude as someone who had worked in the marsh, doing jobs that took him away from home for extended periods, but that she had never fully understood or been able to explain. The discovery of a federal facility with his grandfather's name prominently displayed as a supervisor or administrator completely recontextualized everything Marcus thought he knew about his family history. Claude Thompson hadn't been a fisherman, trapper, or oil field worker, as Marcus had vaguely assumed based on his grandmother's evasive descriptions. He had been involved in some kind of federal operation that had required the construction and operation of hidden facilities throughout the Louisiana marsh region. Ranger seemed to sense Marcus's emotional state and moved closer, offering the comfort of his presence while maintaining his alert posture in case the situation required protective action. The dog had developed an acute sensitivity to Marcus's stress levels during their military service and knew how to provide support during difficult or emotionally challenging moments. Marcus opened the filing cabinets carefully, finding that the contents had been well preserved by the climate-controlled environment of the underground facility. The files contained documents that appeared to be related to some kind of monitoring or intelligence operation, with references to activities throughout the Louisiana coastal region during the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s. The documents were stamped with various federal agency markings and classification levels, indicating that Marcus's grandfather had been involved in sensitive or classified work that would have required security clearances and adherence to strict secrecy protocols. The papers included personnel records, operational reports, and correspondence that painted a picture of a significant federal presence in the Louisiana marsh that had been completely unknown to the general public. As Marcus examined the documents more closely, he found personnel records that included a detailed file on Claude Thompson, complete with photographs, security clearance information, and performance evaluations that covered more than 2 decades of federal service. The man in the photographs was unmistakably a close relative, with the same facial structure, build, and physical characteristics that Marcus saw in his own reflection. The resemblance was unmistakable and profound. This was clearly Marcus's grandfather, but the man depicted in the federal personnel files was completely different from the vague, shadowy figure that Marcus had imagined based on his grandmother's reluctant and incomplete descriptions. Claude Thompson had been a significant federal employee with responsibilities that had extended throughout the Louisiana coastal region and had involved coordination with multiple federal agencies. The personnel file indicated that Claude Thompson had been involved in what appeared to be environmental monitoring, coastal surveillance, and intelligence gathering operations that had required the construction and operation of hidden facilities throughout the Louisiana Marsh region. The work had been classified at levels that would have prevented him from discussing any details with family members, and the security requirements had apparently created significant personal and professional challenges. The documents were heavily redacted, with large sections blacked out to protect information that remained sensitive even decades after the operations had ended. But Marcus could see enough to understand that his grandfather had been involved in work that was remarkably similar to Marcus's own military career in intelligence and special operations. Claude Thompson had been responsible for operating concealed facilities, conducting surveillance operations, coordinating with federal authorities, and maintaining security protocols, all activities that had defined Marcus's own service in special operations units throughout his military career. The parallel between his grandfather's work and his own seemed too significant to be coincidental. What struck Marcus most powerfully was the realization that his grandfather had been involved in work that required the same kinds of skills, dedication, and personal sacrifice that had characterized Marcus's own military service. Claude Thompson had been serving his country in a different era and in a different context, but the fundamental requirements of duty, secrecy, and commitment to mission accomplishment had been remarkably similar to what Marcus had experienced during his years in the army. Marcus continued examining the files and discovered documents that began to explain why his grandmother had never been able to discuss Claude Thompson's work or provide details about his activities and responsibilities. Claude's work had been classified at levels that required absolute secrecy, preventing him from discussing any aspects of his professional life with family members and creating personal isolation that had apparently persisted throughout his career. The security requirements had extended beyond simple job-related secrecy to include restrictions on social activities, community involvement, and even casual conversations that might inadvertently reveal information about federal operations in the region. Claude Thompson had been required to maintain a cover identity and to avoid any activities or associations that might compromise the security of the facilities and operations he was responsible for supervising. Among the documents, Marcus found a personal letter that Claude had written but apparently never sent, addressed to his wife and daughter and dated several years before Marcus's birth. The letter revealed a man who was struggling with the isolation and secrecy requirements of his position, expressing his frustration with being unable to share important aspects of his life with the people he loved most. The letter was deeply personal and emotionally revealing, showing a side of Claude Thompson that had been completely hidden from his family by the requirements of his classified work. He wrote about his pride in serving his country and his belief in the importance of the work he was doing, but also about his regret that the security requirements prevented him from being the husband and father he wanted to be. Claude expressed his hope that someday his family would understand the importance of the work he was doing and would be proud of his service to the country, even though he could never fully explain what that service entailed. He wrote about his dreams of eventually being able to share his experiences with his children and grandchildren, hoping that they would follow in his footsteps of service and dedication to something larger than themselves. The letter also contained references to Claude's concerns about the long-term impact of his work on his family relationships and his worry that the secrecy requirements would create permanent barriers between him and the people he loved. He wrote about trying to balance his commitment to his mission with his responsibilities as a husband and father, and about the daily struggle of maintaining a double life that prevented authentic communication with his family. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he read his grandfather's words, and began to understand the personal cost of the service that Claude Thompson had provided to his country. The man he had never known had been facing many of the same challenges that Marcus had experienced during his military career. The difficulty of maintaining family relationships while serving in classified positions, the isolation that came with being unable to discuss important aspects of his work, and the hope that his service was making a meaningful difference for future generations. The parallels between Claude's experiences and Marcus's own military service were profound and emotionally overwhelming. Both men had served in positions that required significant personal sacrifice. Both had struggled with the challenges of maintaining relationships while bound by secrecy requirements, and both had found purpose and identity in serving something larger than themselves. Ranger sensed Marcus's emotional state and pressed closer, offering the kind of silent, supportive presence that had sustained Marcus through the most difficult moments of his military career. The dog seemed to understand that they had discovered something that was deeply important to Marcus's understanding of himself, his family, and his place in the world. As Marcus continued exploring the facility, he found evidence that Claude Thompson's work had continued for many years and had involved significant coordination with other hidden installations throughout the Louisiana coastal region. Maps and communication logs showed a network of facilities that extended throughout the Marsh area, all apparently focused on monitoring activities related to national security, environmental protection, and intelligence-gathering operations that had been deemed critical to national interests. The scope and sophistication of the network suggested a major federal operation that had continued for decades, involving significant resources and personnel while remaining completely invisible to the general public. The facilities had been designed to operate independently while maintaining communication and coordination capabilities, and they had apparently been successful in remaining undetected throughout their years of operation. The discovery that his grandfather had been involved in work that was so similar to Marcus's own military service felt like a profound connection across generations and a validation of choices that Marcus had made throughout his life. The sense of duty, the commitment to service, and the willingness to make personal sacrifices for larger purposes appeared to be family characteristics that had been passed down despite the secrecy that had prevented open discussion of these values. In another room of the facility, Marcus discovered personal items that Claude had kept in his workplace, photographs of his family, letters from his wife, and small mementos that had provided comfort during long periods of isolation in the Marsh facility. Among these items was a photograph of a young boy who Marcus recognized as his father, taken during a fishing trip in the very area where Marcus had grown up exploring the Marsh. The photograph was particularly poignant because it showed Claude and Marcus's father sharing the kind of outdoor activity that Marcus remembered from his own childhood with his grandmother. Despite the secrecy and isolation required by Claude's work, he had clearly maintained his connection to the land and traditions that defined Louisiana Marsh culture and had tried to pass those values on to his family. The personal items revealed a man who had tried to maintain his identity and connections to family and community, despite the professional requirements that kept him isolated and prevented him from sharing important aspects of his life. Claude had surrounded himself with reminders of what he was protecting and serving, using photographs and letters to maintain emotional connections that couldn't be sustained through normal family interaction. Marcus found additional documents that explained what had happened to the facility and why it had been abandoned in apparently good condition. Claude Thompson had continued his work until his death in the early 1980s, but changes in federal priorities, advances in technology, and shifts in strategic focus had made the network of hidden Marsh facilities obsolete and unnecessary. The installations had been systematically decommissioned and sealed during the mid-1980s, with instructions that they be left undisturbed to avoid compromising the security of former operations or revealing the extent of federal activities in the region. The facilities had been designed to remain stable and secure even without active maintenance, and most had been successfully concealed and forgotten. The realization that his grandfather had died while still maintaining the absolute secrecy about his work explained why Marcus's grandmother had never been able to discuss Claude's activities with Marcus or provide answers to his questions about family history. Mère had known that Claude's work was important and classified, but she had never been told the details of what he was doing, why it required such extreme secrecy, or how significant his contributions had been to national security. The security protocols that had governed Claude's work had continued even after his death, preventing family members from learning about his service or understanding the importance of what he had accomplished. The secrecy that had protected operational security during Claude's lifetime had also deprived his family of the knowledge and pride that should have accompanied his service to the country. Among the final documents that Marcus examined was a sealed envelope with his father's name written on it, in Claude's handwriting, along with a notation indicating that it should be opened only in the event of Claude's death or the decommissioning of the facility. Inside the envelope was a lengthy letter that Claude had written to his son, explaining his work and expressing his hope that future generations of the Thompson family would understand and be proud of his service. The letter was addressed not just to Marcus's father, but specifically to future generations of Thompsons who might someday discover this place and learn about the work that was done here. Claude had apparently hoped that his family would eventually find the facility and would be able to understand the work that had kept him away from them for so much of his life, and that had required him to maintain secrecy, even with the people he loved most. Reading his grandfather's words, Marcus felt a profound sense of connection to a man he had never met, but who had faced many of the same challenges that had defined Marcus's own military career. Claude Thompson had served his country in a different era and in a different context, but the fundamental requirements of duty, sacrifice, and commitment to mission accomplishment had been remarkably similar across the generations. The letter also contained specific instructions for accessing additional documents and materials that Claude had left for his family, hidden in other locations throughout the facility and designed to tell the complete story of his service and sacrifice. The instructions were detailed and precise, suggesting that Claude had spent considerable time planning how to preserve his legacy and ensure that his family would eventually understand the importance of his work. Following Claude's instructions, Marcus found a hidden compartment behind a false panel in one of the facility's storage areas. The compartment contained a comprehensive collection of photographs, letters, and personal items that told the story of Claude's life and work in much greater detail than the official documents had provided. Among these materials was a detailed journal that Claude had kept throughout his years of service, documenting not just his professional activities, but also his thoughts about family, duty, and the challenges of maintaining personal relationships while serving in classified positions. The journal provided insights into the man behind the secret operations and revealed someone who had struggled with many of the same issues that had affected Marcus during his military career. The journal entries covered more than 20 years of service and provided a comprehensive record of Claude's thoughts, experiences, and evolving understanding of his role in protecting national security. The entries revealed someone who had taken his responsibilities seriously, who had found deep satisfaction in serving his country, but who had also struggled with the personal costs of the secrecy and isolation that his work required. Marcus spent several hours reading through his grandfather's journal and examining the other materials that Claude had left behind for his family. The experience was emotionally overwhelming, as Marcus finally understood the family history that had been hidden from him throughout his childhood and military service, and as he began to see the connections between his grandfather's service and his own choices and experiences. The journal entries revealed Claude Thompson as a man of deep principle and commitment, someone who had understood the importance of his work and had been willing to make significant personal sacrifices to ensure its success. But they also revealed someone who had struggled with loneliness, who had missed important family events and milestones, and who had worried about the long-term impact of his choices on his relationships and his family's future. Ranger remained patient and supportive throughout Marcus's exploration of the family materials, occasionally checking the facility entrances and monitoring their surroundings for potential threats, but primarily focusing on providing emotional support for Marcus during this profound and life-changing discovery. As the afternoon sun began to filter down through the hatch opening, casting long shadows into the underground facility, Marcus realized that he needed to make important decisions about what to do with his discovery. The facility clearly contained materials that had once been highly classified, and there might be federal agencies that would want to know about the location and contents of the installation. But Marcus also understood that this discovery was deeply personal and represented the missing pieces of his family history that he had been seeking throughout his life. His grandfather had specifically hoped that future family members would find this place and would understand his legacy of service and sacrifice, and Marcus felt a responsibility to honor Claude's wishes while also respecting any ongoing security concerns. The discovery had also provided Marcus with a new understanding of his own identity and purpose. The sense of duty and commitment to service that had defined his military career wasn't just personal choice, it was part of a family legacy that connected him to his grandfather and probably to other family members whose stories had been lost to the secrecy requirements of their service. Marcus decided that his first responsibility was to ensure that his grandmother, Mère Claudette, had the opportunity to see the materials that Claude had left behind and to finally understand what her husband had been doing during all those years when his work had kept him away from home and prevented him from sharing important aspects of his life with his family. Mère was now in her 80s and in declining health, but she deserved to know that Claude's work had been important and meaningful, and that his secrecy had been necessary for national security rather than indicative of any lack of love or commitment to his family. The knowledge that Claude had left behind explanations and expressions of love might provide her with closure and understanding that she had been seeking for decades. Before leaving the facility, Marcus carefully documented everything with his phone's camera, creating a comprehensive record of the installation and its contents that would preserve the discovery regardless of what decisions were made about the site's future. He also collected the personal materials that Claude had specifically left for his family, including the journal, photographs, letters, and other items that told the story of the Thompson family's hidden legacy of service. The process of documenting and collecting the materials took several hours, during which Marcus found additional evidence of the scope and importance of his grandfather's work. The facility had apparently served as a regional command center for a network of installations that had monitored activities throughout the Louisiana coastal region for more than 2 decades, contributing to national security in ways that had never been publicly acknowledged or recognized. As Marcus and Ranger prepared to leave the underground facility, Marcus took one final look around the chambers where his grandfather had spent so many years serving his country in secret. The facility represented a connection to family history that Marcus had never known existed, and it provided context for understanding his own sense of duty and commitment to service that had defined his military career. The discovery also explained why Marcus had always felt drawn to military service, and why the structures and purposes of military life had felt natural and familiar to him from the beginning of his career. The legacy of service and sacrifice had been passed down through generations of Thompson men, even when the family history had been hidden by the requirements of classified work and national security. Marcus carefully secured the facility hatch and marked the location with his GPS coordinates before he and Ranger returned to their John boat for the journey back through the marsh toward home. The return trip provided Marcus with time to process what he had discovered and to plan how he would share this information with his grandmother, and potentially with federal authorities who might have an interest in the facility. As they navigated the familiar channels toward home, Marcus reflected on how this discovery would change his understanding of himself, his family, and his place in the world. The questions that had troubled him throughout his childhood had finally been answered, and the answers revealed a legacy of service that connected him to previous generations in ways he had never imagined possible. The pawprints that Ranger had detected and followed into the marsh had led them to much more than a hidden tunnel or abandoned facility. They had led Marcus to a family history of service and sacrifice that provided him with identity, purpose, and understanding that would sustain him throughout the remainder of his life. That evening, Marcus sat on the porch of his house with Ranger beside him, looking out over the marsh as the sun set through the cypress trees and Spanish moss. In his hands were his grandfather's journal and the letter that Claude had written for future generations of the Thompson family, documents that had finally explained the mysteries that had surrounded Marcus's childhood and family history. Marcus had called Mère earlier and had arranged to visit her the following day to share what he had discovered and to show her the materials that Claude had left behind for his family. He knew that learning about Claude's work and seeing the evidence of his love and commitment would be emotional for her, but he also believed that she deserved to understand why her husband's work had required such secrecy and isolation. The discovery in the marsh had provided Marcus with much more than just family history. It had given him a sense of purpose and connection that would help him navigate the challenges of civilian life and would provide him with the foundation for building a meaningful future that honored his family's legacy while serving his community and his country. Understanding that his grandfather had faced similar struggles with duty, family, and the requirements of classified service provided Marcus with perspective on his own experiences and challenges during his military career. The knowledge that service and sacrifice were part of his family's identity gave him confidence that his own choices had been consistent with values and traditions that extended across generations. As Marcus read through more of Claude's journal entries by the light of his porch lamp, he found advice and insights that spoke directly to the challenges he was facing in his transition from military to civilian life. Claude had written about the difficulty of finding meaningful purpose after years of service, about the challenge of maintaining relationships after periods of isolation and secrecy, and about the importance of connecting with family and community after extended periods of duty-focused living. The journal also contained detailed knowledge about the Louisiana marsh environment, including information about wildlife patterns, weather prediction, navigation techniques, and survival skills that had been passed down through generations of the Thompson family. Claude had maintained his connection to the land and traditions of Louisiana, even while serving in a classified federal position that had required him to maintain distance from his community. Marcus realized that his discovery of the facility and his grandfather's legacy represented an opportunity to honor the Thompson family tradition of service, while also finding his own path forward in civilian life. The knowledge and insights that Claude had preserved could be shared with appropriate authorities, while also being used to strengthen Marcus's connection to his community and heritage. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked carefully with federal authorities to properly report and document the facility that he had discovered, ensuring that any materials that remained classified were handled appropriately, while also preserving the family materials that Claude had specifically intended for his descendants. The process of working with federal investigators, historians, and archivists to understand the full scope of Claude's work provided Marcus with additional insights into his grandfather's service and its significance in the broader context of national security and environmental protection efforts during the Cold War era. The network of facilities that Claude had helped to operate had apparently contributed to intelligence gathering and monitoring activities that had been crucial to national security for more than 2 decades. Marcus also began sharing his grandfather's knowledge about the marsh environment with local conservation organizations, educational institutions, and community groups, ensuring that Claude's expertise would benefit future generations of Louisianans who were working to protect and preserve the unique ecosystems of the region. The traditional ecological knowledge that Claude had preserved in his journal and personal notes represented valuable information about historical wildlife patterns, seasonal changes, and environmental conditions that could inform current conservation efforts and help protect the marsh for future generations. Ranger played an important and active role in these activities, serving as both companion and working partner, as Marcus explored other sites that Claude's maps and journals suggested might contain additional materials, installations, or information relevant to understanding the full scope of the Thompson family's service to the country. The dog's training in detection and search operations proved valuable in locating and documenting other elements of the network that Claude had helped to operate, and Ranger's presence provided Marcus with the confidence and support needed to undertake potentially dangerous exploration activities in remote areas of the marsh. 6 months after the discovery of the underground facility, Marcus stood once again on the island, where he had found his grandfather's hidden legacy. But this time, he wasn't alone. Mère Claudette was with him, along with several other family members and friends who had helped Marcus understand and preserve the materials that Claude had left behind for future generations. Mère had been deeply moved by learning about Claude's work and understanding why secrecy had been necessary throughout their marriage. The knowledge that Claude's service had been important and meaningful, and that his inability to discuss his work had been due to national security requirements, rather than any lack of love or commitment to his family, had provided her with closure and peace that she had been seeking for decades. The revelation that Claude had left behind detailed explanations of his work and expressions of love for his family had been particularly healing for Mère, who had struggled for years with feelings of confusion and abandonment related to her husband's secretive behavior and frequent absences from home. The island had been designated as a historical site in recognition of its significance to Louisiana history and the broader story of American intelligence and security operations during the Cold War era. The underground facility had been preserved as a monument to the men and women who had served in classified positions during that critical period, providing future generations with an opportunity to understand and appreciate the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. The site would serve as a reminder of the often hidden contributions that ordinary Americans had made to national security, and would help ensure that the stories of people like Claude Thompson would not be forgotten or overlooked by history. Marcus had also established a scholarship program in Claude's name to support young people from Louisiana who were interested in careers in environmental science, conservation, military service, or public service more broadly. The program ensured that Claude's legacy would continue to benefit future generations while honoring the values of service, dedication, and commitment to something larger than oneself that had defined his life. The scholarship program also provided Marcus with a way to remain connected to his community and to contribute to the development of future leaders who would continue the tradition of service that had characterized the Thompson family for generations. As Marcus looked out over the marsh that had shaped both his grandfather's life and his own, he reflected on how the discovery of the hidden facility had provided him with the family history, sense of purpose, and understanding of identity that he had been seeking throughout his life. The pawprints that Ranger had followed into the marsh had led them to much more than just a hidden tunnel or abandoned installation. The discovery had revealed a legacy of service and sacrifice that connected Marcus to previous generations and provided him with the foundation for building a meaningful civilian life that honored his family's traditions while contributing to his community's future. The hidden tunnel had revealed their family name, but more importantly, it had revealed the values and commitments that would guide Marcus in serving others and preserving the land and culture that had shaped generations of Thompsons. Ranger sat beside Marcus, watching the sunset paint the marsh in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the still water of the bayou. The dog had played a crucial role in the discovery that had changed Marcus's life, and he continued to serve as both companion and partner as Marcus built a new life that honored his family's legacy while contributing to his community's future. The veteran and his dog had followed Pawprints into the marsh, seeking nothing more than exploration and exercise, but what they had discovered was a family history of service and dedication that provided them with purpose, connection, and understanding that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. The hidden tunnel had revealed not just their family name, but the values and traditions that would guide them in serving others and preserving what they loved most. As darkness settled over the Louisiana marsh and the sounds of the bayou filled the evening air with the calls of night herons, the splash of feeding fish, and the distant rumble of tugboat engines pushing barges toward New Orleans, Marcus Thompson understood that his service to his country and his family was far from over. The discovery of his grandfather's legacy had provided him with the foundation and inspiration to continue serving, but in ways that honored both his military training and his Louisiana heritage. The quiet marsh that had hidden Claude Thompson's secrets for decades would now serve as a reminder of the continuing legacy of service that connected past, present, and future generations of a family that had found their purpose in protecting and preserving what they loved most. The pawprints that had led them into the marsh had brought them home to themselves and to the understanding that some bonds transcend time, secrecy, and even death itself. In the years that followed, Marcus Thompson would become known throughout Louisiana as a conservationist educator, advocate for veterans and their families, and a bridge between the military community and the civilian world that military families often struggled to navigate. But he would always remember the day when Ranger's keen nose and faithful companionship had led them to the discovery that explained everything about who they were and why they had been drawn to serve. The hidden tunnel in the marsh had revealed their family name, but more importantly, it had revealed the values and commitments that would define their future together, ensuring that the Thompson family's legacy of service would continue for generations to come.